joined now by Sharon Cahir from Cahir Company Solicitors for a look back at the year that was 2025. Sharon, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Alan. Good morning to the listeners, and happy Christmas.
Same to yourself. Thanks very much for being with us. So what were the big issues or the hot topics from a legal perspective this year?
Well, I think, first and foremost, we have to, because everybody's working so hard in the run up to Christmas, we have to mention the employment law changes that came into place. And I think as we hear about the flu and the colds and people, a lot of people being off sick, it's just important to remind, everybody that the statutory sick pay changed earlier this year and people are allowed 5 statutory days. But I think what's last is that it's only 70% of what you're entitled to on that particular day, or up to €110, so it's capped, and you also have to provide a certificate from your doctor. So I know sometimes it's particularly hard on employers, but equally so on the employees. I suppose it falls short of what the full day would be, and they do have to have gone to a doctor for the certificate to qualify. So I suppose there's a burden on both sides. This is the time of year now where everybody's talking about the auto enrolment and the pension.
We've had a lot of talk about that on the show, and the days are ticking for that to come into effect.
And I think, to be fair, many of us were just throwing our eyes up to heaven to go, here's another thing. But the reality is, with younger people, I've heard them talking, about pensions or setting it up.
This will be transformational.
I think it will be. I do think it will be, certainly for younger people who get in early, even if it's only a small amount and they're leaving it in there for the next 40 years, whether they go into the auto enrolment or whether they set up a separate pension. But it's forcing people to think an awful lot earlier than they would have done. So I think it's positive. It's like the state savings at the time, putting away money, and nobody thought about the benefit of it, but there was a benefit. So I think longer term, as we look at the age demographics out ahead of us and what's presenting in the next 20, 30, 40 years, then I think that will be very helpful to the state and the economy, but also individual households will be better set up to retire, and maybe retire earlier than many of us still working.
And Sharon, another hot topic was one that we discussed many times on Morning Focus throughout 2025. One that, when we spoke with employees, they very much welcomed. However, when we spoke with SMEs, it was usually the negative connotation attached to this. It was another headache for them, the increase in the national minimum wage.
Yes, look, I mean, here's the reality. It doesn't matter how much you put the wages up at the moment. It's not enough to keep pace with inflation. So, and I hear that again. I've somebody of younger generation home for 6 months, and in fairness, I hear that firsthand in terms of the money doesn't stretch far enough when you're on the minimum wage. The challenge for employers equally, I know it, and also because maybe the quality of the quality of people available to take certain roles, there's a disconnect then, where even if you're paying the minimum wage, sometimes that feels costly perhaps for the skill set that may or may not be available for the job. So there's a real disconnect going on in the employment market there as well. People want to feel valued. The minimum wage, the inflation is outpacing what people are bringing home, and employers every which way, you hear it all the time on the programme, including the auto enrolment, including the minimum wage, I suppose in terms of retention and talent, trying to locate the best people for jobs. There's extra costs everywhere for the employer, and particularly I know you know it firsthand when people are talking about on the high street versus online, there are challenges. So it really is quite a challenging time for everybody working, but also for those providing employment for people. And I think it's easy to say the minimum wage is very low, but certainly, and I do think as we see the climate change, we will see businesses close. We'll continue to see the high street, change hands in different units and things like that. And just because the costs are so high for people to run businesses.
Yeah, and another issue that we covered on the show, we're great at covering all the big issues here on Morning Focus, was of course the gender pay gap reporting. Yeah,
and I think again longer term that can only be good. It's been stretched now that businesses that have 50 employees now have to statistically report what they have, and that'll work its way down into smaller businesses as well, because I think perhaps in smaller businesses it may be more obvious, but until we see the statistics we won't know. know. I think also if you take, I know certainly in legal, where there's more women than men now, I don't think we'll see that across many of the salaries nationally, or certainly in Dublin I'm seeing a disparity when I see some of the figures coming out. So I think it's good for big firms to be held accountable, and big is even 50, relative to here in town, 50 is big. So I think as people report it, we're going to see where perhaps we're challenged, and then we can add to it to make sure there's more equality, and that there isn't as much of a gender pay gap. Because the other thing that happens is that we have to face the reality that there are more women out working now. There are more women perhaps in high pressurised jobs, and therefore what's the support that somebody else is able, is somebody the wind beneath your wings, or the lead on your wings? So the idea of making it worthwhile that people are out, and that in homes people can find that balance as well, and that can only happen if that gender pay gap is bridged.
Okay, let's talk about some of the, I suppose, key topics or issues that cropped up when we were joined by yourself, Avril and William, throughout 2025. Capacity is something we discussed quite a bit with you. Anything new in particular in that area that you'd like to highlight? Yeah,
there is a really important changes that are rising in relation to capacity, where our local judge, actually Judge Jeffrey Shannon, who's now sitting in the capacity courts, has actually made a groundbreaking, I suppose it's a written decision now, where he had to consider where a residential facility brought forward a case objecting to the marriage of two people within the residential facility on the basis of capacity, that the gentleman in question wasn't able to make that decision and wouldn't know and understand the nature and the context of getting married because of the facility he was living in. And it's interesting where, and if anybody looks up the law, it's called In the Matter of AB. It was a circuit court action, and it was in relation to personal life decisions and whether this particular person could make a specific personal decision. And some of the arguments were whether or not he could make this decision. It was a really big decision, and the judge found, even though this was a really big decision, what the judge actually did was look at the supporting documentation of the medical evidence there as to what was the capacity of the person. And this is what we're finding, is that to any medical practitioners listening this morning, the level of reporting with regards to medical capacity for somebody who has an intellectual disability is very high in terms of what you have to give the judge. It's not just a cognitive writing in terms of yes, they remember or they forget. It's actually quite a high functional capacity report that's required by the judge. And the judge, having looked at the reports, felt they weren't fit for purpose to show that the person didn't have sufficient capacity to know what he was at. The judge also said that capacity is a decision specific. So it's a specific decision, point and time, that in this case that he wanted to get married, and the gentleman, he was saying, did have sufficient capacity based on what he had seen through the case running, and that even though a person may lack capacity for one decision, they might have it for other matters. So it isn't just a blanket like we used to have in the wards of court, which is really, really important for anybody in the community to know, that this Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act is really rocking in the courts now, in terms of it being looked to see whether somebody, just because we judged them in the past, they may not have had capacity, it doesn't mean they have no capacity for anything at all, particularly in relation to wards of court, where people have been put into the wards of court system. Everybody in the wards of court system at the moment is being assessed in relation to what level of capacity do they have. And a recent court case found that there was a particular female and she'd had an injury, and she was made a ward of court, and she was assessed now in the discharge under the new Act. They're discharging people from the ward of court process, and now putting them into different categories as to whether perhaps somebody would assist them to make decisions, or maybe it's a co-decision maker, or it's someone to make a decision for them. In this case, she was found to have capacity. She can now have full domain over her own care and health decisions and her own finances. So that's a huge turn up for the Irish legislative books to do that.
Okay, and let's move on to succession then, and wills, which is something I think we touched on quite recently with yourself.
Yeah, I mean, look, we saw recently where, the big thing coming out is the amount of people in County Clare that haven't got a will, so we can't encourage people enough to put something in place. But there was a recent case that I think we're all still talking about. There was a Mr. McNally, now deceased. He had made a will, and he'd actually left his house in South Circular Road in Dublin, which would be quite an expensive house. He left it to his brother, but later he amended the will. He had written changes on it, and as you know, I'm totally against that. But he had changed it. He had changed his wishes, and instead of leaving the house, it looked like he intended to leave him £1.
A bit of a difference, isn't there, between a house and a pound?
So that was the claim in relation to whether the High Court would uphold the amendment to the will, and the man would get the house or he'd get the £1. And in this case, the High Court held the handwritten amendments were invalid because they weren't properly executed and witnessed. So when we talk about a will being made, and I abhor the homemade wills, it's because generally something is missing in the technical side, and it makes it so easy for a will to be overturned. In this case,
I was just going to say, could they be contested or overturned?
Absolutely. So in this case, the man had amended it, and the court then had to look at that to see, was that a valid amendment that would change the original will, and it was found not to be valid, and so therefore the sibling in this case got the house. So I suppose really the judgment is very, very specific, and it's a really clear warning that homemade wills and any informal alterations will not be held up. What's also really important is that even though this happens every single year, there were a couple of landmark cases, and one of them was in relation to a lost will, where again it sets the bar very high for a copy of a will to be re-entered or reconstructed so it will be accepted as a valid will. So therefore, accurate searches where somebody who searched, particularly if a will was in a law firm, and whether it was collected by somebody or not. So a very specific judgment set up very, very clearly what the bar would be if a copy will is to be admitted. So it's, by affidavit, and very, very clear as to who undertook the search. Even if wills moved from one practice to another, who had it, where did it move, was it seen? Really, because the court has to look and see, perhaps somebody destroyed it. Perhaps they didn't want their will in being, and therefore you have to override that concern that perhaps it was destroyed, so there was no will at all, and everything would pass on intestacy, whereby whoever's in the will or the executor in the will want to bring forward that copy will is the will that we should be reading. Okay. So the court is very, very clear on that, and really important for people to be aware of that. Okay,
just a minute or so left to us. Can we finish on property?
I think this isn't this the really hot topic for the next coming 4 or 5 months. So look, there is no doubt that the new act, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act that came in this year, there's no doubt that it has caused an exodus of landlords. We have seen more notices served this year than we've seen any other year. So it's real. We're seeing it, and it's tangible. Very difficult for tenants. I don't think that the way the government has gone about it has in any way engaged the landlords to stay in the market. We've seen them firsthand, the letters going out to people to say, please reconsider. Yeah, I don't think that's a runner at all. It's a lovely letter, but
the government would say, they come up with loads of measures in the budgets to help landlords, but I suppose the smaller landlords,
but the problem is the landlord will have gone past the 1st of March, and tenants will be there on a 6-year rolling tenancy, and particularly we're seeing an exodus of older landlords over retirement age. They're saying, well, this is my retirement fund. I will want to sell it. If I'm stuck for another 6 years, then and I'm limited in how I can ask someone to vacate, it's very challenging. So, the landlords are leaving the market, which is very, very tough for the housing market, at the moment. And again, I suppose the rent pressure zone has been nationalised, so everybody is under that, whereas there were certain localities that were actually under it. What we do see is a lot of downsizing. So we see a lot of older couples trading down and buying in town. But again, there's a gap to be bridged in terms of finances when you're selling one and buying the other. So the banks are looking at that. Now it's an exorbitant interest rate that they're looking at in terms of funding the purchase while you arrange the sale and you do the transition over in a limited period of time by which that money would be available. But it will be worth it in some cases if people can trade down. The bigger challenge is for the person trading down when you're selling your house. Even if your house is 500,000, what are you trading down to? The availability of smaller houses within the urban site, which older people will want is quite limited at
Near
the moment.
amenities that they would require.
Absolutely. So we see that very real. We see a huge amount of mortgages, and there's been a lot of approvals, but again, couples trying to find houses. So renewing letters of loan offer is quite normal these days. They run beyond the 6 months within which they can find a property, and that seems set to run as well into 2026. So that's going to be a challenge in itself. What is happening that's positive is, I suppose, the government, certainly the Law Society, are involved in terms of digitising, the mechanism within which properties are bought or sold. Banks have to release the title documents within 10 days. So there's certain things to try and speed up a transaction, but I don't think it's the speed of the transaction. If we can buy and sell a hotel in a week or two, then we can do that with houses. It just needs a willing party on both sides. It needs available funding. The biggest challenge at the moment is there aren't the houses to be able to do the transaction. So everything else can be done. If there's a will, there's definitely a way to get it done. It's definitely not on the lawyers, the delay. Sometimes there are technicalities, sometimes there are title issues, sometimes somebody's in chain. All of these things are real, but that's not what happens in every single transaction. Like a purchase and a sale can be done within 4 weeks. If you're a willing buyer, willing seller, 2 solicitors that want to do it, you have the money to pass hands, the title is fine. As I say, there aren't enough houses for us to be doing it on. We'd like lots more.
That is a much bigger discussion, one I've no doubt will be having many times well into 2026 and possibly beyond. We will be joined by you again, and Avril and William, in 2026. Sharon, thank you very much. Happy Christmas and Happy New Year, and we'll see you the other side of it.